Welcome everybody, part 2 of Masekhet Sanhedrin with Faur. Let's begin.
Okay. All right. So I just want to start today's class. I want to explain what I'm going to be doing. And in order to do that, I'm going to be sharing the screen with the source that was not on the resource sheet, but it's one paragraph. And here it is. I believe you can see it, correct? Okay, good. So this is a passage from my father's article regarding how the Gemara was studied in the Sephardic Andalusian tradition. And it was studied in 3 stages. The first stage was what was called Girsa or Surat HaDishmata. That's what we're going to be doing today. The second stage was Iyun, which is not what we're going to be doing yet, although we will hopefully get to some Iyun later. And then the final stage is Talmud or Pesach Halacha, Halacha Lema'aseh. Let me read to you now the paragraph regarding the first stage, Girsa. And I'm putting my arrow over it. I don't know if you can see it, but you probably could. I'm going to make it a little bigger. There you go. Okay, Girsa. The purpose of this first stage of studying Gemara is to know the shape of the Shema Teta. Shema Teta in Aramaic means the lesson. So as you know, the yeshivot in Babel, they had these lessons, which were basically summaries of discussions that took place in the yeshiva with respect to specific issues. So the summaries of these lessons are what we have in the Gemara. That's called the Shema Teta. So each sugya is actually a Shema Teta. It's a lesson, and each lesson was organized in a very specific way. So I'll give you an example. For those of you who may have gone to law school, when you study, a particular case, so the case has the title, and then the case will have, let's say, the name of the court where it went to. The case may have some procedural matters. Then they'll actually have a discussion of the facts. Then they will have analysis of the law. That's a particular way to structure the particular case that came before the court. The structuring of the Tsugyot in the Gemara was actually very different. The structuring of the Tsugyot in the Gemara wasn't based on that breakdown, but rather what it was a summary of the entire lesson that was given to the Talmidim. And oftentimes these summaries, they took place, or these lessons rather, they took place over several generations. So what you'll have in the sugya is you'll have a multi-generational approach to a particular problem. You will see how this was done in one yeshiva, then maybe you'll see how it was done in the same yeshiva a generation later, right? So when the Gemara was edited, he took the various lessons, he put them together in an organized fashion, and what we have is the Shemua. Now, when the Gemara was edited by Rabbi and Rav Asher, they actually gave the Tsugyot particular structures, okay? And the structures of the Tsugyot, or knowing the structure of the Tsugyot, is the first step in studying the Sugya. Now, why should that be? So when you're trying to organize information in your mind, and you don't really know where you're going and what the next step is and what the goal is, it becomes a little confusing and muddled, right? So what the editors of the Gemara did is they organized the Tsugyot in very, very particular fashion, so it would be easy to remember them by heart and go over it in your mind as you review it. So now when you have the structure, it's really easy. Well, I don't want to say it's really easy, but it's easier to understand it by heart and to follow it mentally. In addition, as a student studying the Sugya, beforehand, I tell you, here's the map. Here's what we're going to be doing. Here's the various parts. And then we go over those various parts. Then it's much easier for you to organize information in your mind and to follow the discussion in a meaningful fashion. So I'm now going to unshare my screen, stop share. And voila, I'm going to pin myself so you can see me more clearly. There. Okay. So let's now go forward. And I'm going to, do you all have the map of the sugya that I prepared? Or, yeah? Is it good? Is there a need for it to be shared on the chat, or I can assume that everybody has it? What do you think, Sina?
I can share it on the chat while you're speaking. could share a link to it if you want, or you can share the screen, whatever's easier for you.
So you can share a link. I share a link to it on the chat.
I think Michael's just posted it. There we go. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, great. All right, so please open up that map, because this is what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be taking you through this sugya, and I'm going to be taking you through the Surata Dishmateta level, and this will give you all a bird's eye view of the sugya. Okay, so I'm going to give you a moment to open it up while I have another sip of my espresso, which was made special for this class. Okay. All right, so here it is. So this sugya deals with a particular linguistic problem. The linguistic problem is the Mishnah, the first sentence of the Mishnah. We discussed that last week, and it's summarized in the first few words of the sugya. So the first few words of the sugya is basically telling you, here's what we're going to be dealing with in this sugya. So you see where I say Gemara, right? And then I have that in a gray field, right? The words are in a gray field. So just so you know, and so when you follow this map, this is going to make your life easier. You'll notice that some of the letters have a colorful background to them. And then some of the letters don't have a colorful background to them, right? There's no background. The letters with the background are the words of the Gemara, right? So you'll see the words of the Gemara in the background shaded field, right? And you'll know that's the actual Gemara. And the rest of the stuff is stuff that I'm writing about the words of the Gemara. So I just wanted to make this easy. So you see there's a great background to the first few words. That was the problem. That was a problem under consideration. Namely, you will recall that the Mishnah starts Dine Mamonot Bishlosha, Gezelot Lachavalot Bishlosha, and there's a certain redundancy in adding the words Gezelot Lachavalot Bishlosha. We already said Dine Mamonot Bishlosha, that includes Gezelot Lachavalot. So that's a problem. That's a problem that Sugya is going to deal with. And I want to show you the map. I want to first give you a nice overview of the Sugya, okay? In a very general fashion. So you see this part one, right? Which is in this big black bold letters. There's part two. If you go down, you scroll down to, I think, page 2. There's part 2, and there's part 3. That's the sugya. This is called the sugya meshuleshet. It's called the sugya meshuleshet because there's 3 parts to the sugya. And you'll see that each one of the 3 parts of the sugya in turn has 3 subparts. In fact, the first subpart of the first part of this sugya has 3 subparts. Okay, and you're going to see it all, nice, colorful letters. Okay, so you'll see. Now, what I did is, again, I want to teach you how to use this map so that you can review it and understand the sugya. So let's look now, part 1, Rabbi Abhu's approach to the textual problem. Okay. That's in the first page. So this part 1 is going to deal with Rabbi Abhu's approach to the problem raised. And as I said, Rabbi Abhu was in Eretz Israel, in Caesarea. He took a particular approach. Let's go now to part 2. Part 2 is, it's going to look at the same problem, exact same issue, exact same question, but instead of looking at it from the perspective of Rabbi Abhu, we're going to look at it from the perspective of Rava. Rava was the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Abhu was the Rosh Yeshiva in Caesarea, as I mentioned last week. He was a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan, so 2nd, 3rd generation in Moraim. Rava was a Rosh Yeshiva of Fombedita. Now, just so you know, in the days of Rava, he moved the yeshiva to his neighborhood. So it's known as Rava di Mechoza. Rava di Mechoza means Rava from the city of Mechoza, and in his days, the yeshiva moved to Mechoza as a special honor to Rava. So it was the same yeshiva. It was the yeshiva from Bedita, but as I said, they moved to the city of Mechoza. So just so you don't get confused, thinking, oh, there's Yeshivat Mechoza, which is one thing, Yeshivat from Bedita is the other, and Rava was the Rosh Yeshiva. Most of the faculty moved to Mechoza, not all, but most of them moved to Mechoza, and Rava was recognized as a Rosh Yeshiva. So part 2 of the sugya is, how did Rava approach the same thing? Okay, so that's clear. Obviously, it was different. It was a different approach. We'll see. And finally, scrolling I'm getting an indication that my internet is not stable. If you can't hear me or see me, please let me know and I will switch to a different router, which I have handy this time so I don't have to, interrupt for too long. So far, can you all hear me and see me well?
So far, yes. It's just a little bit blurry, but it's coming in and out, but it's okay for now.
If it switches, if the situation deteriorates, let me know. I have this nice little thing and I could switch to it.
Thank you.
All right. All right. So part three of the Sugya is going to be the rejection of Rabba's thesis by the next generation. Allow me to explain. The next generation in the same yeshiva. As I said, Rava was Rosh Yeshiva in Fom Betita, and there's going to be certain challenges to the way Rava studied the Sugya. So we're going to reject his approach. We're going to reject his approach, and we're going to finish the Sugya. We're going to finish the Sugya with that. Okay? So the Sugya is really simple. And where is that? That's in the last page. If you have the map, part 3, this is big black bold letters, part 3, Roman numeral 3, rejection of Rava by next generation. That's all. All right. Good. Now let's look at each one of these major parts. Now let's go down to greater detail. Okay. So go back to page, I guess it would be page 2 really, because the first page is just the title page. So go to page 2. The top of the page says a linguistic problem to be considered in Sugya 1. Go to part 1, the Rabbi Avu's approach to the textual problem. Let's look at it. So this part 1, Roman numeral 1, is divided into 3 subparts. The first subpart, which is in the green letters and the big letter A, capital A, the interpretation of the Mishnah according to the Rabbi Avu. That's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at how Rabbi Avu understands the Mishnah, the meaning of the sentences or the meaning of the words in the Mishnah, right? That's one question. The second question, which is now capital B in the blue letters, the halachic position of the Mishnah, because there's a language. And number one is, how do you understand the language of the Mishnah? That's part A. Part B is, okay, so what is the halakha? What is the halakha according to Rabbi Avu? If you understand the Mishnah in one way, the halakha will be one way. If you understand the Mishnah in another way, the halakha will be another way, right? So that's part B. And finally, going to part C, right? Part C, which is in the orange letters, a legal evaluation of Rabbi Hanina's position regarding the use of non-expert judges. Let me explain that a little. In part B, we're going to be introducing Rabbi Hanina, and we're going to be introducing a certain concept. And the concept is as follows: can or may you use non-expert judges in the Jewish judicial system? So generally, when you have judges, right, you assume that the judges are experts, right, and that the judges are have certain qualifications, right, and that they've been, so to speak, vetted. So I want to read with you the Lashon of Harambam, just so you understand this concept a little. What do we mean by, expert judges? And what do we mean by vetting them? So if you go to the resource sheet, I believe I put it here, but maybe I didn't. If not, I can always just open up Harambam. Here it is. If you look at the resource sheet, Mishneh Torah Sanhedrin 5:8. And let's see how this works. Going to number 4. I believe it's there. All right. No. So what I would do now is I'm going to share the screen with you. I'll open up the Mishneh Torah and then I will share the screen with you. It's going to be Sanhedrin, Perek He, Halacha Het. Okay? So give me a moment.
Do you want me to share it? I've got the source sheet up if you want to. It's up to you.
Sure. Okay. Please do that.
It's right here. There you go. That's the one.
Very good. Perek halacha het. Good. So perfect. So let me read it. So dine kenasot, right? Keron gezelot v'habalot, v'tashlumei chefel v'tashlumei alva v'hamisha, v'haones v'hamfateh v'chayose bahen, en danin otam ella shelosha mumchim behem asemuchim be'eretz Yisrael. Okay, so let me tell you what this is about. Yeah, and keep it there. No need to scroll up. It's perfect, actually. So in Jewish law, there's cases where the defendant would have to pay the amount of damages that he caused to the plaintiff, and that's just what are the actual damages, and the actual damages are whatever they come out to. But then there are cases where there is a penalty provision, where we're saying, okay, the damages were X, but you actually have to pay 2X. That's a penalty. That's called dineh kenasot. And here are examples of cases where there's a penalty. Gezelot. Gezelot is some sort of armed robbery, for example. So b'hamishito Yosef alab, he would have to pay a 20% or 25. Actually, it's a 25% penalty. Havalot, some sort of injury. Tashlumei chefel, that would be, for example, where you a burglary, a hidden robbery, right? And so you would have to pay double the amount that he robbed. Tashlumei alva v'hamisha, other cases, similar cases. Haones, hamfateh. So these are all cases where there are penalty provisions. So in the case of penalty provisions, the halakha is very careful. We don't want non-expert judges imposing penalties upon defendants, because if you impose a penalty, more than the actual damages, you have to be particular. You have to be careful, right? And that's why he says, "En danim otam ela shelosha mumchim." In that case, you need to have 3 expert judges. So those cases absolutely require expert judges. And how do you vet the judges? What's the vetting process? These judges will receive the semicha from other judges who themselves have the semicha, who are themselves expert judges, and they will determine. So basically, the vetting process is there has to be some sort of evaluation of the student by a senior judge who himself is an expert judge, and he will determine whether the student is worthy or not worthy of being called a samuch. And if he's samuch, he will give him semicha, akin somehow or analogous. I don't like the word ordination, but I'm throwing the word ordination out there because you're all familiar with it. Okay, and this ordination takes place only within the judicial system existing in the land of Israel. So that's semuchim, the Eretz Yisrael. Of course, as you know, I don't think anybody's going to be terribly shocked to find out that there is no semicha today. There is no real semicha, not in Eretz Yisrael, not in America, not in London, right? Right? There's no semuchim to Eretz Yisrael, and one of the questions that always arises is, how is the semicha going to restart? Not the subject for our case. I mean, if there's no semuchim alive, then how can you ever restart the semicha? That's a different question. Let's continue now in the text. Aval she'ar dine mamonot, but other dine mamonot keron hodaot. Hodaot is a case where one person admits that he owes money to another person, and this is done in the presence of witnesses. Halvaot, somebody lends money from somebody else. And in this case, you don't need a mumche. And the reason you don't need a mumche, you don't need an expert judge, is because there is no kenas. So because there is no kenas, we're willing to rely on business people who are familiar with these types of contracts, people who are familiar with these types of business transactions, because there is no kenas, and we will therefore say, well, look, he owes him $100. He didn't pay the $100. Let him pay the $100, right? You can have people who are did not receive this special semichat rabbanut. Okay, so that's what I wanted. I wanted to introduce you to the subject. I'm going to read one more sentence in Harambam. Lefichach Danin behodaot vehalvaot v'chayoseh bahen b'chutz ha'aretz. Outside the land of Israel, as we said before, the semicha is only inside the land of Israel. So outside the land of Israel, where there is no semicha, and today also inside the land of Israel, there's no semicha, we can have all the halvaot. So today, when you go to a court for dinei mamonot, the dinei mamonot will be for hodaot vehalvaot, generally, right? Generally speaking, meaning nobody's going to go to a court today in Israel and say he robbed me in the middle of the night. I'd like to get tashlum mechilta. I'd like to get double liability paid to me. They won't do it because they don't have the authority to do it. And the reason they don't have the authority to do it is because there is no semicha. Okay. And that's it. So that's all. You can unshare the screen now, Sina. So good. Okay. Let's continue now. So as I said, subpart C, which is that nice orange letters, right? So in subpart B, we're going to be dealing with the case of mumchim, or we're going to be introducing the idea of mumchim. We're going to be introducing Rabbi Hanina's position on mumchim, right? And Rabbi Hanina's position is that you don't always need to have expert judges, right? That you can have hedyotot. So we're going to evaluate Rabbi Hanina's position in this part C. Okay, so now you see a very clear path. So again, the first major part, part 1, Rabbi Avuza's approach to the textual problem. It has 3 subparts. You see each one of the subparts clearly, right? So that when we actually study the Tsugyot, you will know where we're going. Okay, let's now do the same thing for part 2. And by the way, I want to show you something. Look, for example, part 1, subpart C, orange letters. Look at number 2. You see in number 2 where I quote the Gemara, Umatam amru bedine mamonot laba'enan dirisha v'hakira. Do you see that there's a big letter over there? Right, that's not a typo. That big letter with a squiggly line under the big under it, there's a squiggly line under the big letter. There's a bet. You all see it? That's meant to indicate that there is a variation in the girsa, and having looked at the older manuscripts, I detected this variation, and I'm putting in the variation here. That's the squiggly line indicates where I accepted the girsa of the older manuscripts. And when we study the Tsugyot, you will see why these girsaot are so important, because oftentimes when you're studying Gemara, there is something rather confusing in the flow of the text. Not all the time, but sometimes that confusion can be alleviated by looking at the old girsaot, and then the confusion can dissipate, right? So that's what that is. So if you look now at part 2, Rava's approach to the textual problem, right? If you look at A in the green letters, again, the Academy of Mechilta, you see how there's a whole passage in the Gemara. I should have highlighted that in green. That was a mistake. Right? There's like a line going across. That indicates the past. I should have put a green background there also. I didn't. But nevertheless, that indicates that's the original girsa. So right now, if you open up the Gemariot, you'll see that area where there's a line going through, and I'm going to read it for you. That line, which goes through that text, indicates that's actually what you will see in the Gemariot before you. You have the Vilna Shas, all of you have the Vilna Shas. That's the girsa in the Vilna Shas. Below it, you see I have the girsa as it appears in the older manuscripts, and you see the squiggly line, and it's a different girsa. Now, when we study this, you'll see the difference between the girsa. You'll see that the girsa as it appears in the Vilna Shas, at least from my perspective, is a bit problematic and raises certain difficulties. And those difficulties are solved in this case by looking at the older girsa. So you'll see that. Okay, having said that, because I want you to know how to read my map. This is a map of the Tsugyot. I want you to know how to read it, okay? So let's look at each one of the subparts. So part A, subpart A. The Academy of Mechilta rejects Rabbi Abu for textual consideration. So you can imagine that the subject of the Mishnah came up in the yeshiva. They brought Rabbi Abhu's interpretation of the Mishnah, and as they're studying Rabbi Abhu's interpretation of the Mishnah, this is several generations later in a different country, in Babylonia, they raise certain objections. They say, listen, we disagree, right? They can do that. So they raise those difficulties. That's in part A. Part B, in the blue letters. The interpretation of the Mishnah according to Rava. So what is the alternative explanation of the Mishnah? That will be in part B. How does Rava understand the Mishnah? And finally, part C. What compelled Shemuel to interpret the Mishnah in this manner? As you will see, and maybe I could have been a little more clear here. It should have been what compelled Rava to interpret the Mishnah in this manner. So forgive that, confusion. But part C is going to tell us why Rava interprets the Mishnah as he interprets it. Okay, and that's it. That's the end of part 2. Let's go now to part 3. All right. Part 3 actually takes place in the same yeshiva. We said part 2 took place in Yeshivat Fombedita, which was physically located in Mechilta at that time. And part C takes place in Yeshivat Fombedita. Okay? So, and this is the beauty of Talmud Torah. And I want to, it would be okay if I make a slight digression here. Okay. And this happens all the time. Anytime, halachic issue comes up, but this rabbi said that, and I hear other rabbis when they give classes, this rabbi said that. One of the issues that comes up, I'm just gonna, throw it out there. Some of you may have seen my class on using an electric lamp for Nerot Shabbat, the permissibility or more invalidity of using an electric lamp for Nerot Shabbat. So listen to the classes. This rabbi said that rabbi said that, but this rabbi said that, and this rabbi said that. The only thing missing from these discussions is, can somebody actually look at the law and look at the Gemara and tell me, what does the Gemara say? Give me an actual legal analysis. It's missing, and I hear that all the time. I mean, no. There's some Talmidei Chachamim who give very good halakha classes, but there's a lot of that going around where they start quoting rabbis, and this rabbi said, and that rabbi said, and can you explain the law? Can you analyze what's a ner Shabbat? Something. Give me some sort of understanding. And what we see in the Gemara, if the Gemara was this rabbi said that, you wouldn't have a Gemara, right? The whole thing would be, the whole Gemara would be like 5 pages. This rabbi said that. And that's, that's end of the discussion. I guess that's end of the discussion. But here you see that in Yeshivat Fombedita itself, Rava was one of the greatest, most revered, most respected Rashi Yeshiva. And they're not embarrassed to challenge him and to ask questions against him. As Rava was not embarrassed to challenge the great student of Rabbi Yochanan. He's challenged Rabbi Abu. This is the nature of Torah study, right? So when I try to study halakha, I could be wrong, but at least analyze the subject. You understand? Meaning, analyze the subject. And if you want to quote rabbis, of course, you can quote rabbis. That's great. You should quote rabbis. You should read what they said. You should understand what they said. But it doesn't stop there, right? So the great lesson of the Gemara is keep studying and use your mind to try to understand clearly what and what the legal issues are, right? Right, that's important. That's really, I think there was a student of my father. His name is Rabbi Alan Uter, who, by the way, is great. He writes fantastic. I recommend him very. Can you still hear me? I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable.
Yeah, it was a little cut out a little bit, but it's okay for now.
Okay. So the Rabbi Alan Uter, a really fantastic writer who wrote many, many articles on many subjects. His son, I think his son's name is Josh. Poetry.
It's cut out again, Rav. You may want to change it.
I will do that. Give me a moment, please. Okay. Am I back?
For now.
For now, I think this should be better. I think this should be better. And hopefully there'll be no issues. Right. And you can hear me well now? No.
So far, yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay. Godolatry. Godolatry, I think, was coined by Josh Uter. And the idea of godolatry is, there's a gadol, the gadol says something, and that's it. The only problem is you always have different gadols, and different gadols say different things. So, it's nothing against revering and respecting chachamim. Of course not. We respect and revere all chachamim, but that's not the way of Pesach Halacha, right? The way of Pesach Halacha is to understand the issues and to analyze the issues. But okay, be that as it may, that's a great lesson from the Gemara. So let's look at part 3. Rejection of Rava by the next generation. All right. This part 3 is it starts with a statement by Rav Aha Bered Rabika, who introduces something, let's call it revolutionary, dramatic, and that is the permissibility of adjudication by a single judge or by an individual judge, in contrast to Rava. Right. Part B will look at the requirement of 3 judges. Where does that requirement come from? And then part C will offer 3 challenges to Rav Aha's thesis. So that's it. That's the whole sugya right there. The whole sugya, you just have the summary. It's all been mapped out to you. We can begin studying the sugya now, but this is the surata dishmateta. You should all have a very clear picture, and just seeing it on the actual colorful map, which I made, will hopefully help you follow the class that I'm now about to give in the few minutes that we have left. Okay, any questions till now before we go to part 2 of the class? Okay, good. So here's what I want to do in part 2. In part 2, I want to take you through the actual language of the Gemara. Okay, so we're going to start with the beginning. The title is, just one second, please. Let me just open up my notes. Right. Okay, good. So let's now start with the actual text of the Gemara. I'm going to be reading the text as it appears on the map, because when it's on the map, it's just so much easier to follow. But, if you have a proclivity towards books, as by the way, I do, I always like using books. Just in this case, I'm going to be using the map because it's here and it's easy to follow. If you wish to open the book, open the book. If you want to follow the map, follow the map. The words are all here. Okay, let's start. So, Gemara. And I'm going to read it with the melody, the traditional melody of reading Gemara. Tu gezelot v'chavalot la dine mamonot ninhu. The question is clear. Do you mean to say that gezelot v'chavalot are not included in the category of dine mamonot? That was the question. And now we're going to have the first 2 parts of the Gemara will deal with that specific question. Here is Rabbi Abhu. Now, look at part 1, Rabbi Abhu's approach to the textual problem, and you'll see that part A, the interpretation of the Mishnah according to Rabbi Abhu, itself has 3 subparts, right? Because you didn't have that in the other. If you go down to part 2 of this, Sugya just has A, B, C. A wasn't further divided into 3 subparts, right? Just, I want to make you aware of that. But here, if you look at part 1, you look at A is divided into 3 subparts. Look at B is divided into 3 subparts. And you look at C is divided into 3 subparts. So it's really the Chachamim. It's hard to say. I know people like to say that everything is a coincidence, the theory of evolution and all that. I got it. This is a text. It's very compelling. The idea that the Chachamim did this intentionally is very compelling, because when you see the sugya after sugya after sugya, the way it's structured, it's like, okay, so they knew what they were doing. And the Chachamim Sephardim in the Andalusian tradition, when they studied the Tsugyot according to Sugya Surata Dishmateta, they apparently had a very solid tradition as to how to study Gemara. So you see it here before you. Okay, so let's go now. Rabbi Avu's approach to the textual problem. The first is subpart A, the interpretation of the Mishnah according to Rabbi Avu, and it's as follows. Number one, the actual interpretation of the Mishnah. Here it is. I'm reading it to you. Amar Rabbi Avu, mahen katane, mahen dine mamonot, gezelot, halalot, aval hodaot, v'halvaot, la. Okay. Rabbi Avu says to properly interpret the Mishnah, you have to read the second clause, gezelot v'havalot, as that is. So the reading of the Mishnah is dine mamonot b'shlosha, and when I say dine mamonot, mahen. What is dine mamonot? Gezelot v'havalot. So gezelot v'havalot comes to interpret, but more importantly, limit dine mamonot. When I said dine mamonot, I didn't mean all dine mamonot. What did I mean by dine mamonot? Gezelot v'havalot. Okay, so again, Amar bi'avu mahen katane mahen dine mamonot, gezelot v'havalot. By the word dine mamonot, Rabbeinu HaKadosh meant specific type of dine mamonot, gezelot v'havalot. Aval hodaot v'halvaot la. But as far as hodaot, which we explained, a person admits that he owes money to another person. As far as halvaot, a person borrowed money from somebody else. This is not included in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is not dealing with that. Dine mamonot b'shlosha does not include hodaot v'halvaot, although hodaot v'halvaot is part of dine mamonot, but this is not what's meant by the Mishnah. Why? We'll see. But this is the interpretation of the Mishnah. Now, subpart 2 is going to explain the reasoning of Rabbi Avu. It's going to explicate Rabbi Avu's interpretation. And here it is. Usricha de'itana. And we needed to formulate the Mishnah. Sericha means it was a necessity. What was a necessity? The formulation of the Mishnah in this way, namely, that formulation was a necessity. Why? If the Mishnah would have only said the words dine mamonot, I would have, of course, understood the words dine mamonot b'shlosha to include all dine mamonot, and therefore I would understand the Mishnah to include hodaot v'halvaot. But as you remember, it doesn't include hodaot v'halvaot according to the Yehu. Tana gezelot v'havalot, and that's why it adds after it says dine mamonot b'shlosha, it immediately clarifies. By this I mean, I'm sorry, gezelot v'havalot. Excuse me. Continuing. Ve'itana gezelot v'havalot. If the Mishnah would have, instead of saying dine mamonot b'shlosha, gezelot v'havalot b'shlosha, the Mishnah could have said gezelot v'havalot b'shlosha. Why not? And then I would know it's gezelot v'havalot b'shlosha and not hodaot v'halvaot. So ve'itana gezelot v'havalot ve'la katane dine mamonot. If it would have just said gezelot v'havalot b'shlosha, that would have led to a potential misinterpretation. Hava amina, I would have understood the Mishnah, or I would have believed that the Mishnah means I would have understood that gezelot v'havalot comes to illustrate a type of dine mamonot, right? If it would have just said gezelot v'havalot b'shlosha, I would have said, yeah, okay, gezelot v'havalot and other things like, it would have been gezelot v'havalot, etc. b'shlosha, an implied term, right? Remember last week we spoke about implied terms? I would have understood gezelot v'havalot, etc. b'shlosha. That's the way I would have understood it. And again, what would be the problem? That I would think that the Mishnah includes hodaot v'halvaot. And that's a mistake. It doesn't include hodaot v'halvaot. All right. And the reason, according to this particular line of thinking, that the Mishnah, when it says gezelot v'havalot, it means gezelot v'havalot, etc. Right? why would the Mishnah choose gezelot v'chavalot as the example of dine mamonot? Why do that? I mean, why? According to that, the Mishnah could have said hodaot v'halvaot, etc. bishlosha. Why did it choose gezelot v'chavalot bishlosha? According to that line of reasoning, and the answer is mishum deikal shlosha dichtivi b'gezelot v'chavalot ketiva, because the Mishnah would have been following the lashon of the Chumash. And I'll explain that in a moment. But again, if the Mishnah would have said dine mamonot bishlosha, I would think that's a general category that includes hodaot v'halvaot. If the Mishnah would have said gezelot v'chavalot bishlosha, I would have thought gezelot v'chavalot means gezelot v'chavalot, etc. And the reason the Mishnah chose gezelot v'chavalot as an illustration of dine mamonot, right? It's because the Torah uses gezelot v'chavalot, or it's following the lashon haTorah. It's following the fact that the Torah itself illustrates the law of three judges in the case of gezelot. So it's following the Torah, and that's why it chooses gezelot v'chavalot and not hodaot v'halvaot. All right. Again, the hayde katane gezelot v'chavalot mishum deikal shalosh adichtivi b'gezelot v'chavalot ketivi. Okay. So therefore, what's the conclusion? Well, the conclusion is dine mamonot bishlosha. That is gezelot v'chavalot. It couldn't have just said dine mamonot. It couldn't have just said gezelot v'chavalot. It had to say both, and only by saying both, it's pointing us to a certain direction. Okay, so that's the textual analysis of the first few words of the Mishnah as Rabbi Avu analyzes it. There's one last thing that we kind of have to tie up, and that's going to be subpart 3. We said ikal shelosha dichtivi b'gezelot v'chavalot ketiva. We said that in choosing gezelot v'chavalot, it was choosing as the model what the Torah uses as a model to teach us shelosha dayanim. So where is it that the Torah teaches us the law of shelosha dayanim with respect to gezelot? So right now in subpart 3, it gives us where. Now let me explain to you. This is a summary of a Mechilta. There's a Mechilta, and I think it's in the resource sheet. If you open it up now, just go to the resource sheet for a moment. I think I'll have it somewhere as well. Okay, at least I think I have it. Oh, there you go. Okay, very good. So there's a Mechilta. This is now, just so you understand, the book of Shemot has 2 Mechiltot. The book of Shemot has Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, and it has Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. This is Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael. So if you can please scroll, keep scrolling down. So here you have the Mechilta, and in the Mechilta, you have this derasha. This derasha is brought fully in the Mechilta. Meaning, how do we learn the laws of 3 dayanim? So the Mechilta brings certain pesukim that have to do with robbery. And in those pesukim, the word Elohim, which means judges, appears 3 times. And the Mechilta teaches us, why does the word Elohim appear 3 times? To teach us that you need a minimum of 3 judges in the case of gezelot. All right? Is that clear? Right, so that's a Mechilta. Now, why am I not reading the Mechilta with you right now? I'm just made you aware of it. Why didn't I read it with you? Because further down, they're going to go through the Mechilta. I think in Sugya number 3, right? In Sugya number 3, they're actually going to go through this Mechilta. I don't find it necessary to take you through the Mechilta. I do find it necessary to explain to you what's happening. So where, with respect to which monetary issue do we learn the law of Shelosha Dayanim in the Chumash? And the answer is with respect to gezelot, right? So now you see now you can unshare the screen. So now you understand the reasoning of Rabbi Avu's explication of Rabbi Avu in subpart 2. Since we learned the law of 3 dayanim in the context of gezelot, that's why the Mishnah would have brought gezelot v'chavalot b'shlosha, right? And I would have learned, oh, but it means etc. It's giving us a case that appears in the Torah, but it appears for all. But this law of Shelosha Dayanim, this law of 3 judges, it applies to all cases of monetary issues, right? That's why. So the ikar Shelosha dichtivi b'gzelot v'chavalot ketivi. Now, and now look at part 3. So part 3 it's as I said, it's an allusion to this particular Mechilta, right? So here we go. I'm reading to you part 3 now. Gezelot tichtiv v'nikra ba'al habayit ela Elohim. And it's paraphrasing the Mechilta. The Mechilta continues, right? So it's a little confusing. You're looking at this, you say, well, I only see the word Elohim once. People, in order to, perhaps I should have said this, as part of the admission to the yeshiva, the Talmidim had to be experts and had to be fluent in the Tosefta, in the Sifra, in the Sifre, in the Mechilta. So it wasn't necessary in the context of the Tsugyot to bring the entire Mechilta because people were familiar with the Mechilta. So it's just kind of bringing you the first sentence of the Mechilta. So Gezelot tichtiv v'nikra ba'al habayit ela Elohim. Habalot, mali haval begufo, mali haval b'mamono. What about havalot? Let me explain this to you. If you look at the Pesukim over there in that same place, it deals with the laws of havalot, with the laws of injury, right? And the lesson here is, if gezelot requires 3 dayanim, right? And gezelot is, relatively simple matter. A person robbed, he was caught. He has to return what he robbed, the amount, the value of what he robbed, and he has to be penalized depending on the particular situation, right? Of course, in the case of, for example, havalot, a fire spread, there's a lot of questions. Was it windy? Was it foreseeable? Was it reasonable? Right? There's all these questions. So if in the case of gezelot, the Torah says you have the word Elohim 3 times, and therefore we learn you need to have 3 judges. And it brings right there the laws of halalot. Of course, the law of 3 judges applies as well for havalot. I think you all understand, and I said this last week, that when I say of course, right, kal vachomer, a fortiori, there's a foregone conclusion, right? There's a foregone conclusion. There's an understanding of the law, right? Meaning nobody actually sits down at these pesukim and wait, how many judges do we have to use in a case of financial matters? Well, let's count the number of times that the word Elohim appears. Oh, and if it appears there, let's, of course it should apply to havalot. Later on, the pasuk says, "Im kesef talvet ami," the laws of halvaot, right? So the point is, it's rhetoric. I take it seriously. I take it very seriously. And by the way, Harambam says in the Moreh Nebuchim, a lot of this rhetoric contains within it many of the secrets, many of the sodot of the Torah. So I don't mean to belittle it, chas v'shalom. I'm not belittling the rhetoric. I'm just pointing out what came first, the chicken or the egg. What came first, the law of Shelosha Dayanim or the derivation from the Pesukim? And the answer is the law of Shelosha Dayanim came first. And the derivation is a rhetorical device used to tie the pre-existing law that we received by tradition to the Pesukim. Very important. I think I just solved people many visits to psychologists and many other such issues that can, apply if you look at it the other way around. So I'm just trying to help everybody here and be kind and gentle. So that's important. That's important to know that, right? So I will I will go on now to the next part of the sugya, and therefore, and finally, Rabbi Ahu's conclusion, which is a repetition of 1. That's why I call it number 1, because it just repeats the same thing. That's why Tana, ma hen dine mamonot. And this is why the Mishnah, or Rabbeinu HaKadosh, when he formulated the Mishnah, he says, so, dine mamonot bishlosha. Ma hen dine mamonot? What do I mean when I say dine mamonot? Do I mean all dine mamonot? No. Gezelot v'havalot. I mean gezelot v'havalot, aval hodaot v'halvaot la. But this comes to exclude hodaot v'halvaot. That's it. That's the first subpart of part 1. Again, we're studying now Rabbi Ahu's approach to the Mishnah. We just looked at the textual issue from the textual perspective. Now we're going to look at the Rabbi Abhu from a halachic perspective. Okay, let's do it. We have a few minutes. It's remarkable. It's an espresso. It's a double espresso. It should have been finished 45 minutes ago. So I can only conclude that I'm doing something right because you all are familiar with the Kad Hashemen of Elisha HaNavi and the poor lady who had to redeem her children from slavery, and she just kept pouring and pouring and pouring, and the miracle happened, and it didn't. The oil never ended. So I'm making a similar analogy with my espresso. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I don't know. Nevertheless, let's get to part B. Part B, the halachic position of the Mishnah according to the Rabbi Abhu. So part B starts with the following word. The word is ulmai. Ulmai. Ulmai literally means for what reason? Meaning, for what reason would the Mishnah include gezelot v'chavalot in dine mamonot and say dine mamonot bishlosha, meaning you need 3 judges in the case of gezelot v'chavalot, but you don't require 3 judges in the case of hodaot v'halvaot. Apparently, I mean, if you're telling me that hodaot v'halvaot is excluded from the Mishnah, well, then you're telling me that it doesn't require 3 judges. So is that what you're saying? So ilema, and that's exactly the first part. Ilema de la ba'enan shelosha ve'ha'amar Rabbi Abhu shenaim shedanu dine mamonot b'dibrei hakol en dinehem din ela de la ba'enan mumchim. Okay, perhaps ilema, when the Rabbi Abhu excluded hodaot v'halvaot from the purview of dine mamonot, did he mean to say that hodaot v'halvaot do not require 3 judges? That would be a rather unusual conclusion. And the reason that would be a rather unusual conclusion is because here the Gemara says, Ve'ha'amar Rabbi Abhu, Rabbi Abhu himself says, Shenaim shedanu dine mamonot, 2 people, judges, sitting and adjudicating a financial matter. L'divrei hakol en dinehem din. This is an improper. There wasn't a proper quorum. You need 3 judges, 2 judges. It's an invalid ruling. So obviously, you cannot say that Rabbi Abhu is trying to teach us that hodaot v'halvaot do not require 3 judges. Of course, they require 3 judges. He himself says so. Ella, rather. So apparently, the intention of the Rabbi Abhu was to say that in the case of hodaot v'halvaot, you don't need to have expert judges. Remember, we studied Harambam, right? You need 3 judges. You just don't need expert judges. So that's a halachic consequence. So again, you see, you have first the textual interpretation of the Mishnah. That's one subject. And now the second subject, what's the halachic consequence? And the halachic consequence is, apparently, according to the Rabbi Abhu, in the case of hodaot v'halvaot, you do not require expert judges, right? Okay, we're going to challenge this. Subpart 2, exegetical challenge 2, and then defense of 1 above. So we're going to challenge it. My kasava. What is the, again, this is rhetoric. How does Rabbi Abhu read the perashiot in the Torah, the relevant perashiot in the Torah? Ikasavar, eruv perashiot katuv kan, liv'ay mumhin. Ve'ikasavar en, I'm sorry. Ve'ikasavar en eruv perashiot katuv kan, shelosha lamali. I'm going to give you just so we can finish it up, because I see that we have 4 minutes, and we will continue next week from this point in the Sugya. But how does Rabbi Abhu read the relevant passages? You remember that we showed you the passage in Perashat Mishpatim from where we learned the law of Shelosha Dayanim, right? Now, in that passage, a little further down, you have the law of Halvaot, right? And the question is, we said, for example, that the law of Shelosha Dayanim applies to Havalot, right? Which is there in the parasha. And now, if you go a little further down, you have the laws of halvaot. So how exactly are you reading this passage in the Torah? Like kasavar. Apparently, we would think that the perashot are somehow connected. There's a connection, they're mixed in, but literally means, perasha means the things from one perasha, or the laws learned in one perasha, impact upon the second perasha, and vice versa, potentially, right? So, if you're going to tell me that the laws in Gezelot, namely Shelosha Dayanim, apply to the laws of Halvaot, right? Because there's Aruf Perashiot, right? You only would learn that if you say that the Perashiot are connected. Then in that case, you can't pick and choose. Well, it also says you have to have Mumhim in the case of Gezelot. So you can't say, oh, you have to have Shelosha Dayanim because of Aruf Perashiot, but you don't need Mumhim. Well, if there's Aruf Perashiot, then you need to take, a person sometimes wants to marry a lady or not marry a lady. She's tremendous eshet chayil. Maybe she's not good looking enough for the person. You have to take the lady as she is, right? You can't, right? So Eruv Perashiot is exactly that. This is a perasha. The perasha says you need 3 dayanim. The perasha of Gezelot says you need 3 dayanim. The perasha of Gezelot says you need mumchim. If you're going to say that the laws of Shelosha dayanim apply to the law of halvaot, well, then also the laws of mumchim apply to the laws of halvaot, right? So ikasavar. Again, if you say that the perashot are connected, then the same way you learn the laws of 3 dayanim from Gezelot, you learn it to halvaot, you would also learn the law of mumchim from Gezelot to halvaot. And on the other hand, you say, no, the 2 perashot are not connected. And the reason you want to say the 2 perashot are not connected is because you don't want to have the laws of mumchim that you have in Gezelot apply to the laws of halvaot, right? Then in that case, well, how do you learn the laws of 3 dayanim in the case of halvaot? So the answer is le'olam kasavar erut perashiot katuv kan ubdinhu deliv einameh mumchin. Actually, there is erut perashiot. Actually, you learn the laws of 3 dayanim in the case of halvaot. You learn it from its connection to the parasha of Gezelot, and also the law of mumchim from Gezelot applies to halvaot. So ubdinhu, according to the standard norms of the word din means judicial analysis of a verse. Ubdinhu, the proper judicial analysis of these verses would indeed require that the law of mumchim, which appears in the case of Gezelot, applies to the laws of halvaot. Yes. So, then why don't we have mumchim? That's a separate subject. That's number 3. That's what we're going to see. I'm reading it to you now. Number 3, Mishum de Rabbi Chanina. There was a Tana called Rabbi Chanina, and this Tana rejected the use of expert judges in certain cases. And it's because of his rejection of the use of expert judges that actually we don't follow what we would normally conclude. Normally, the conclusion should have been, and maybe until the days of Rabbi Chanina, the conclusion was that you need 3 dayanim in the case of halvaot, and you need mumchim. Later on comes Rabbi Chanina and rejects the idea of mumchim. We'll have to explain this later, and we'll see how this rejection affected Rabbeinu HaKadosh when he edited the Mishnah. That's next week. For now, it's past the time, but I do want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. I have not been looking at the chat. I don't know if anybody had a question that they posted for me on the chat, but if it is, you can raise your hand and just,
Thank you, Acham. Let's see if there are any questions in the chat here. Or would anyone like to unmute and ask a question? Nope, no questions. I guess not. Pretty clear.
Okay, excellent. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. Please,
Yes.
you have the map now, review it carefully. And hopefully we will be able to maybe even finish the Sugya next week, perhaps at least, this analysis that we've been doing.
Yes, please. Fantastic. I was saying it feels like we have a cheat code with your Sugya map. It's fantastic. Really, really helpful, and kind of gives a macro and micro view of the Sugya. So looking forward to the whole Sefer, please God. No rush.
All right.
Thank
Great.
you.
All the
Take
best.
care.
Bye.
Good night. Thanks, everybody.